All right, well, why don't we get the show on the road? Greetings and happy holidays, everyone, from Charles Krug Winery. This is the oldest, the most historic, and most storied winery in all of Napa Valley. This is really the place that started all that Napa Valley is today. All three of us are socially distanced in different rooms. I'm in the coldest room in the cellar, but we're sitting in the Redwood Cellar, which was built originally in 1861 and then burned down and rebuilt in, I believe, 1872. So it's got, for America, got a fair amount of history going on for it. This is literally the place that started of all of Napa Valley, and it's still family owned. And it's now in our fourth generation and soon to be fifth generation of what I call the first family of California wines, the original Mondavis. My name is Judd Wallenbrock. I'm the president and CEO of Charles Krug, and I'm your moderator for today's tasting. I'm joined by Le Cave founder and owner Frederick Boelen and third generation co-proprietor of Charles Krug, Peter Mondavi. Wave, yes. Guys, we're gonna have a few ground rules, and the ground rules basically are that there are no ground rules. And that is, we're gonna taste wines from two storied estates, one from the old world, and I'll just try and show up my pictures as we go along here, and also one from the new world, right here. So hopefully you have all those wines, and hopefully what you've done is you've poured yourself a good healthy slug in each of your glasses, and I'm going to encourage all of you to go ahead and sneak some taste. Now we're going to go through the wines and we're going to taste them and we're going to talk about the wines, but through the course of the hour, I can guarantee you that they're going to change dramatically in the glass. So I encourage you to taste right now. We'll taste a little bit later on, and then also at the end of the tasting. So that's pretty much what we like doing. So let's get a little bit started. I have a quote that I love to use, and it said that water separates the peoples of the world, but wine unites them. And here we are. We've got France and we've got the United States, which are separated by a huge body of water. We're separated by a language that nobody else can speak, and we're also separated by a history and all sorts of different things. Yet here we are together tasting these really wonderful wines, stunning wines. And with that said, I just want to point out that this is a comparative tasting. It is not a competitive tasting. Unless we win, then it's a competitive tasting. And I will show my colors right now. All right. So let's get started with some speaker introductions. And I'm going to start with our guest, the guest to Charles Krug, which is Frederick Boelen. Frederick, if you could tell us a little bit about your background, about the wine you're presenting, the story of Chateau St Martial, and also a little bit about Le Cave, your company. That'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Judd. Great introduction. So my name's Frederick Boelen. My great grandfather, so seven generations ago, his name was George Wheeler, and he joined the wine industry in the UK. So that's on my mother's side. My mother's British, and we've been wine merchants since then in the family. And there's still kind of that initial family under the name Mr. Wheeler that is in the UK. And whenever I moved over, so I grew up in Normandy in France. My dad was French in the hospitality industry, and we opened two shops about 4 or 5 years ago now. And whenever I moved over to Napa Valley 4 or 5 years ago now, we decided to import some of those boutique wineries that weren't available here in the US because of obviously production's too small or just not very well known. And so, and then obviously we take those wines and sell them direct to consumer. So that's exactly what we do. And Chateau St Martial, so this bottle right here is a Saint Emilion Grand Cru. So Saint Emilion is on the right bank in the Bordeaux region, so just north of the river in Bordeaux. And the Chateau St Martial was purchased just before the French Revolution. So I think it was 1784, and by the Dupérat family. And obviously has still stayed in the same family since then. And Bruno Dupérat is the current owner of Chateau St Martial. And the person that makes the wine is a family friend of Bruno's grandfather that he met during the war, the Second World War. And so since 1956, that family has been making the wines. And so it's kind of that relationship that Bordeaux has, a little bit like more of a farmland collaboration. And about the Chateau St Martial. So you probably see on the bottle, if you have the bottle here, there's a big stone on there. And so that is actually classified at the UNESCO heritage, international UNESCO heritage, obviously. And it's thought to be, well, it is a Neolithic stone that has been there. And it's thought that it was an ossuary that's underneath. From the Neolithic period, which was 10,000 years to 35,000 years before Christ, so quite a while ago. And this region of France, and there's a chapel on the domain that has a spring underneath that is known, and people used to travel to that specific chapel to get some of that water that is supposed to cure all diseases. So we like to think that whenever we try a little bit of the wine, we kind of grasp a little bit on that soil, and so that's the hope, anyways. But yeah, the wine is the vintage 2015. The blend is a blend of 80% Merlot and 20% of Cabernet Franc from a single vineyard, and there's about 20,000 bottles that are made every year. And so this wine is not available really anywhere else in the US, and only at a few places in France even. Just really handed off to friends and family. So very happy to be able to have you enjoy it today.
Great. Thank you, Frederick. That's awesome. Well, let's turn it over to our co-host, I guess, and that is Peter Mondavi. Peter, you want to talk a little bit about the Krug story, the Mondavi family, the generations, and anything else you want to talk about?
Sure, Judd. Thank you very much. And Eric, I'd love to welcome you to our family estate here. And unfortunately, we can't be side by side doing this, but anyway, it'll be a great event. We'd love to do initially is to share a PowerPoint slide which explains the family history a little bit better than me just purely talking about it. Not nearly as extensive as what Frederick talked about with the wine that he brought to the table here, but I think it's pretty extensive for California's sake. So give me a moment here to set things up. There we go. Just one moment, please. Okay, so I'm going to, as I mentioned, talk about our family tree. My grandparents, Cesare and Rosa Mondavi, immigrated from Italy around 1908. In fact, it was about December 1908. But they had just gotten married a couple weeks before. My grandmother was 18 years old, grandfather a couple years older. More or less sharecropping families, lived out in the countryside in the Marche region, extremely modest means. So they landed and also they had all of about a third grade education. But when they landed in Ellis Island in December of 1908, with about $20, $30 in their pocket, they immediately made their way up to northern Minnesota to the Iron Range. That's where they had family and friends that sponsored them to come to the United States, how it was done back then. My grandfather toiled away in the iron mines briefly, didn't like that. Started a saloon, which I guess was okay until Prohibition set in. So around 1919, it got shut down. He parlayed that into a grocery store. And being that he was dealing in fresh produce, the Italian community rallied around him and said, go to California and source some wine grapes so we can make some homemade wine during Prohibition, which was legal to produce about 4 barrels per household as long as you didn't sell it, consumed it at home. So he did this. He took the train, hopped on the train to California, negotiated some deals, sold these grapes through the grocery store for home winemaking, mainly Zinfandel, little Carignan, Alicante as well, along with probably some other more obscure varieties. He did this for a few years and then saw the business potential of this whole endeavor. So in 1922, moved the family out to California to further the grape shipping business. Became very successful, and that afforded my grandparents the opportunity to purchase Charles Krug Winery in 1943 here in Napa Valley. Of course, as Judd mentioned some of our history, but Charles Krug, a Prussian immigrant, was the founder of the winery in 1861. It's the oldest winery today here in Napa Valley, and we're so pleased that we could be carrying this legacy forward. But that's in the 40s. Now, my father, Peter Sr., I'm Junior, and my uncle Robert got engaged right after the purchase of the winery to reestablish the winery, build it up. And so it was very successful in those years. And then some decades later, 1966, my uncle Robert Mondavi split off from our winery. Even though he retained a percentage ownership in Charles Krug, he split off and started Robert Mondavi Winery with his kids. And then about a decade later, Dad acquired Robert's ownership, his portion in Charles Krug. So from that point forward, Charles Krug has been wholly owned by my dad's lineage, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. But as we move forward, Robert sold his winery in 2004, so there's no family left at Robert Mondavi today. It's sold to Constellation. But getting back to the family tree, so Robert had 3 kids, Tim, Marcy, and Michael. We'll talk a little bit about their endeavors shortly. And then my brother Mark and myself are both completely active here at Charles Krug. We're 3rd generation. And then we have 4th generation. So Tim had 5 kids, Marcy 2, and Michael 2 as well. And we'll talk about some of their kids and their endeavors as well. Mark and Janice have 4 daughters. Angelina is the oldest in our 4th generation group. Angelina is the only actually formally trained winemaker in the 4th generation. She's earned a degree at University of Adelaide in Australia. So she's a consulting winemaker here in Napa Valley and deals in some of her own brands, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, Alicia actually manages some brands for Mark and Janice's family, or for actually the 4 of them. Rihanna is the only one that's fully employed by the winery here, and she is in sales. Giovanna, or Gigi, she works for a Boston-based financial institution, but does a lot of ambassador work for the winery as well. Now, our 2 kids, the youngest in the whole 4th generation there, our son Lucho graduated with master's in engineering about a little over 3 years ago, pursued his love of automobiles, and now has been working in northern Italy for the last 3 years as a vehicle dynamics engineer for one of the auto companies there. Her daughter Leah graduated a little over a year ago and, believe it or not, applied math, but pursued her love of food and moved to London to work for a food tech startup there. But they're also engaged as ambassadors for the winery. Our son Lucho does sit on our board, as well as her cousin Angelina. But now getting back to wines, wine business, Tim and Marcy, once they sold the winery in 2004, started Continuum, a beautiful high-end Napa Valley blended wine up in Pritchard Hill. Michael, a few years earlier, actually started Michael Mondavi Family Estates. He had some small brands he owns. He also started Folio after the sale of the winery, which imports and represents a number of family-owned wineries throughout the world here in the United States. So the G4, not to be outdone by the prior generations, are embarking on some of their own wine endeavors. So Carlo and Dante have Rain, wonderful Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir series, which we have a series in our cellar. And also, I mentioned these earlier, not by name though, but Dark Matter and Aloft are 2 brands that Mark and Janice's family have. And Angelina is the winemaker for those, and Alicia actually manages those brands. So that's a little snippet of our family tree and a little history about the winery itself. So we're going to be, before we jump into the tasting, hopefully you have this Generations 2017, part of our family reserve wines, much more limited, and traditionally were available primarily in restaurants. Of course, that has changed quite dramatically in the current times. But I'd love to do is share a story about Generations and the origin of generations. So back in 1991, my brother Mark was overseeing winemaking here at the winery. The vintage was a very big vintage, a lot of tonnage, getting towards the end of the season. And Mark got a very frantic call from a friend of his who is growing and delivering Cabernet Franc to Duckhorn Winery, which is just around the corner from us. So their tanks were full because of the prolific tonnage that season at the very end. So they could not take the last 5 tons that he had in contract that he had in the vineyard. So he called my brother Mark in a frantic call and said, Mark, can you take these? And Mark looked around and says, yeah, we got a little bit of space, so bring them in tomorrow, which he did. We had some great Cabernet coming in and some great Merlot coming in. So Mark said, what the hell? I'll try a Bordeaux blend, and put 10 tons of Cabernet in the tank, the 5 tons of Cabernet Franc in there, and also 5 tons of that great Merlot in there, just out of a whim. No pre-planning, no nothing. And fortunately, my dad was gone and could not be consulted on this project. He came back a couple of days later from a sales trip in Southern California and went through the fermentation tanks as he did, all his life, to taste them, see what's going on. And he looked at this tank as labeled Bordeaux blend. And so he asked, because Dad was kind of a purist, he did pretty much 100% varietal wines, at least in that era. And so he asked Mark, what is this? And so Mark explained, and of course, Dad just went absolutely ballistic on him. But Dad followed the wine, continued to taste it. After the fermentation, went into barrels. So ultimately, Dad fell in love with this wine, but we still had no idea what we were doing with it. So when we had to bottle it, when it had enough barrel aging time, we put it in a bottle with no plans. So the original bottles of 1991 vintage, if you look at the cork, it says vintage 1991 on it. Has no reference to Charles Krug. And we also bottle them as shiners, which means no label, no capsule. We weren't sure if we're going to put it under a different label and launch it, or just sell this batch of bottles to some other winery and take care of this headache. And then we'd bottled it and it sat in the cellar for a number of years. And then someone, an old cellar master, had been with a family for many, many decades, said to my brother Mark, passing through the cellar, why don't you call it Generations after the multiple generations of family at the winery? Mark thought it was a great idea. That stuck. So in 96, we actually launched the first vintage, 91 vintage of Generations, and have been carrying it on ever since. And I look forward to our tasting of it and describing, going into more depth of the wine as we go through this webinar. So, Judd, back to you.
That's a perfect segue. Thanks, Peter. And as the CEO of the company, I can't tell you how thrilled I was to learn that when I came to the company, that we actually own the word generations. This is a word that, in one word, sums up the entire positioning of the company, right? We're a multi-generational family-owned operation, which I think is just phenomenal. Two things before we start. Or one thing before we start, for those that are in the audience, if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. I'll be manning that, and I can funnel the questions onto our panelists. And at the same time, I'll have a series of questions that are going to go out for all of you guys. So with that, first of all, I want to make sure at this point in time, everybody tastes the wines. So let's make sure we taste the wines. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each one of you, and I'm going to start with you, Frederick, let's talk terroir. And Frederick, as a Frenchman, you get to actually explain what terroir is, because I think we all use it all the time in the wine industry, but I think it bears repeating that what that really means. And then talk a little bit about the terroir of where this wine comes from, and then I'll move over to Peter, and you can talk about the terroir of Generations. So, Frederick.
Perfect. Thank you, Judd. So the terroir in Saint-Emilion, well, let's start, like you said, with the notion of terroir in general. It's really terroir the word terroir really means everything that kind of touches the wine. So the soil and obviously the climate that affect grape growing. That's probably my personal view, is that I believe that the winemaking technique and the actual cellar, how the wine is made, and the winemaker is a part of that terroir as well. I always keep in mind, entering a winery, and then you have ambient yeasts that are there that are going to be transforming the sugars and the wine into of the grape juice into wine, and those really carry some of that terroir, is kind of my belief. But yeah, so the soil and the climate is, so the soil is obviously kind of what type of soil, how it is made, and then the climate, it can be obviously anything from sunshine or rain throughout the year, all the way to kind of obviously the temperatures, humidity, and any kind of cloud cover there is in that region, which obviously kind of varies a lot from one spot to the other. And in terms of Saint-Emilion Grand Cru, for this one, the soil there is it's a sandy gravel, and that's really typical of Saint-Emilion. And to give you a little backstory on Saint-Emilion itself, they've actually been making wine in that region since 56 before Christ, so quite a while back. And the wine every year, in order to have the appellation, is actually tasted. So not only it needs to be from the specific area, I think it's like 40 hectoliters per acre, per hectare, that is the volume that they're allowed to make per surface. And they also the wines need to be tasted by a panel. The wines are tasted, every single wine is tasted in order for it to have the appellation. And that's really been going on since 1199. So quite a while back, over 800 years ago now. And it stopped briefly and in the mid 1800s, and then carried on again after the Second World War in 1956. And so, I do believe that that's kind of part of terroir as well, the notion of appellation and really what touches the wine, because without that appellation, the wine wouldn't be what it is today. And that to me really brings in that notion of terroir. And to kind of further that, just a little bit more on that appellation, the Saint-Emilion appellation are going to have made it compulsory for wineries to transition to more sustainable practices. And any winery that hasn't transitioned by the vintage 2022 won't receive the Saint-Emilion appellation. So it's quite a big statement that they are making, and they've always been kind of ahead of the curve in terms of producing high quality wine, obviously for centuries that this has been going on, and that's definitely a part of that terroir. And yeah, obviously the winemaker's touch as well brings a lot to that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the winemaking maybe next. So that's perfect. We'll start with the soil and then go into the winemaking. So Peter, why don't we talk about the goût de terroir of Napa Valley?
Sure. Well, we started just a touch after France or Saint-Emilion. I think grapes were first grown in home winemaking, I think in about the 1850s after Christ. So I think you have about a 2,000-year lead on us, I believe, if my math is correct. So we're catching up fast, though, I'd like to think. Yeah, the terroir in Napa Valley, and I agree with Frederick's explanation, especially as it relates to the natural setting, the ground, the soil, the weather, climate, exposures, all that aspects to it. But Napa Valley is very interesting from a soil perspective, because it has like half of all soil types that are found around the world. And the way the valley was formed is you have a valley that's roughly more or less north-south, 20, 25 miles long, a couple miles wide at certain points. But the eastern ridge that separates Napa Valley kind of from the balance of California and over towards Nevada, that area, that is really a volcanic driven ridge. That was formed through largely through volcanic activity. Now, the mountain ridge that is on the western side, the Mayacamas, Palisades are on the eastern, Mayacamas is on the western side. That is principally driven by a marine layer influence with the tectonic plates and the Pacific plate coming into California. So a distinctly different soil structure on the western side as opposed to the eastern side in the hills. And of course, these erode and come down on the valley floor and mix and create, you know, very complex and very diverse soil structures, to a certain degree, driving terroir characteristics throughout Napa Valley. Now, for generations, the wine we'll be tasting shortly, or enjoying right now, we hope, is about 80% of it comes from our two vineyards, Volz and Slinson, which is in the center of Napa Valley in the Yountville region, but on the western side at the base of the Mayacamas, so kind of a bench land for the Mayacamas. And remember, this is the marine influenced area. So, you know, a little bit rockier soils, a little bit better drain soils in this area. It gets more of the morning sun, gets some of the hot afternoon sun, but the hills are shading it a little bit. So the sun does set earlier there. Now the balance, 20%, comes from a relatively new vineyard, and Slinson and Volz were purchased back in around 1970 as land, and Dad planted them. Another vineyard purchased around 2000, or actually a little bit before 2000, our Howell Mountain Cold Springs vineyard. We actually purchased 60 acres of forest and were able to scratch out about 20 acres of vineyard in that, about 23 actually. And again, I mentioned 20% of the grapes come from there. So that soil at Howell Mountain, again, on the Mayacamas range, or excuse me, on the Palisades range, on the eastern side, is more volcanic driven. So we have, this white tufa soil, and we have knolls up there that are red, iron-rich red soils in there. It also sits up at an elevation around 1,800 foot elevation, as opposed to the Slinson Volz, which are, 200-300 foot, benchland. So dramatic difference in elevation. There are times when you could be up in that vineyard in the morning and see sunrise is just absolutely gorgeous, crystal clear blue skies. And you look down to the valley floor and you're overlooking an ocean of fog. So clearly a big difference in exposure, sun exposure up in the elevation, because it often sits above the fog level that cools down the valley floor. And there are times when in the morning, I've seen temperatures 25 degrees warm, it could be 70 degrees up in Cold Springs, and then down, 55 under the fog in the valley floor. So huge difference there. And Howell Mountain tends to be a little more tannic in its structure there. So that's my comments on the terroir aspect.
Great. So let's taste the wines. And then what I'd love to do before we start talking about any kind of influence of the winemaker, I'm going to start this time with you, Peter. Maybe you want to just describe what you're tasting in both of the wines. You give what your flavor profiles are.
Sure. First of all, I want to mention, I don't think I mentioned the blend here. This one's, our blend is 83% Cabernet. So this is not a right bank one, which is Merlot driven from France. And there's about 13% Petit Verdot, and the balance is Merlot. So there's a hint of Merlot in here. So dramatically different blend. And I referred to it originally, when Mark first created this, as a Bordeaux blend. And when I refer to that, all it refers to is the fact that it's using the same varietals that Bordeaux is using, or a subset of those varietals. It has absolutely no reference to winemaking style or flavor profile or anything as it relates to Bordeaux. These are two radically different areas with radically different terroirs, and produce notably different, as we'll see today, wines, both beautiful wines in their own respect. So for ours, I get little more fruit notes. A general characterization I have between Old World, New World is New World tends to have a little more fruit notes to it. but dark fruit, blackberries, notes like that. A subtle hint of spice, allspice, maybe a cinnamon coming through on the nose. Good solid tannins. I think that Howell Mountain is coming through, some good bright acidity on it. Again, those really dark fruit notes kind of hiding in the background there as well. So for our wine from across the pond, so in the aromas I get, and Frederick, you can help me out here when you get on here, but little more kind of spice aromatics, herbal notes to it, which makes it very exciting, very complex wine. I think it has more finesse in the nose than our generations. On the palate, again, some of those spice, almost like a potpourri herbal essence coming through. Wonderful complexity on the palate. Very soft, kind of silky, smooth tannins coming through. So a beautifully refined wine. I believe it's 2015. Ours is a 17. So ours is a pretty, well, they're both pretty young wines. But that 2 years could make, also make a difference in when you look at these two wines. And again, not a competition. This is to really educate ourselves and understand differences.
Yeah, that sounds great. Peter, before I leave you, we always talk about wine, not just pairing with food, but actually being food. And I know that you are a foodie. So if you could maybe pair something to eat, it could be something as simple as hearty bread or cheese. But if either one of these wines, what comes in your mind when you think about tasting these wines to maybe pair them with?
Well, for our generations here, I kind of have a knee-jerk response. We do these grill your owns where we get these fantastic dry-aged New York strip steaks. And when we could get together, we'd all huddle around this great grill and throw that steak on there. Just some simple salt, spice. I pour some olive oil from our estate on it afterwards. And that's just a perfect combination for generations. And I think our counterpart here, I think, would be excellent with that. And also, I'd love to hear from Frederick, because when I've traveled, I've done it a number of times, both France, Germany, Italy, great historical wine growing regions that have, well, obviously centuries of history. The food and wine combinations in those areas are just unbelievable, because the food and the wine is grown together. Right. Unlike here in the United States, wine is relatively young in our culture. But our wines, Dad we have roots in the old world. Both our kids have Italian passports, and obviously one's living there. But Dad loved the wine styles that would really pair with food. So our wines tend to be a little brighter in acid from the grapes, and that really promotes a beautiful food and wine pairing.
That's great. So Frederick, let's hear your thoughts on the wines.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first a little something that I probably should have mentioned in the terroir section, but just so everybody understands that California and Bordeaux wine regions are at different latitudes. So Bordeaux is further north than California is further south. And then California, or Napa Valley in particular, is cooled down by a current, the Humboldt current that comes down from Alaska that's very cold and makes it a Mediterranean climate. Whereas the Bordeaux and just general Europe area is warmed up by the Gulf Stream that comes out from the Caribbean. So you have kind of similar temperatures, but the sun is more direct here in California. And so that's really just to explain kind of the main difference in kind of the fruit structure of the wine. So for the generations one, just smelling the wine, you're gonna have that fruit. The word I typically use is the word opulent. So it's right there, it's a big wine, it jumps out, and it's a lot of those bright red fruits really kind of a big wine, but then a finer style to it as well, just on the very long finish. It really has those beautiful tannic structures. And I agree, Peter. I think those two wines, obviously, they can age up to 20, 30 years, no problem. And tasting them right now is obviously great, and that's why we opened them prior, a long time prior, that they can definitely kind of use some of that smoothing out of the tannins. But yeah, delicious wine. I can definitely have that mountain fruit. Can definitely smell that mountain fruit in the wine. So yeah, this one's delicious. Yeah, very soft, really great body. Kind of a good texture on the palate for the generations. And then for the French one, so actually one fun thing that you can do at home if you have them in separate glasses is kind of tilt your glasses forward like this and have a look at difference of color. So you'll see the generations one is more of that ruby color, and then the Bordeaux one is more of that almost tawny color, like tendency to be more on the orange side of the spectrum. Both are very deep. Obviously, you can't see through the wines, and but just looking at the wines that way will kind of give you an idea of the difference on the nose as well, with the really fresh and bright fruit for the generations, whereas for the Chateau St Martial, for the Saint Emilion Grand Cru, yeah, you get more on the nose. So it's a lot more of the wild fruits, maybe just smaller fruits, more on the darker fruits, on the spicy notes, like Peter mentioned as well, and that's driven obviously from the terroir, but also from the barrels we use. So they're aged for the wine's aged for about 20 months in 70% French oak barrels, and that's 70% new French oak barrels. Something to just keep in mind as well, and that's why the wine seems maybe just a little bit fresher, just in terms of the aromas that you find in the wine, maybe just a little bit more like perfumey notes. In the fall, in Bordeaux, it kind of gets cold pretty quick, and it allows the grapes to really hang on the vines a little bit longer, and that really ripens and softens up all the tannins and tones down all of the aromas in the wine. And that's really why for the Bordeaux ones, the life expectancy and really kind of the preferred method of tasting wine is to wait 20 years from the date of the harvest. And at that point, and every year obviously going towards that, you really start developing all of the aromas. And again, that's why we opened the wine prior today, just so we can let the wine open up and breathe nicely. But let's taste it.
Yeah. And Frederick, do you have one of the, this is a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but being a Californian and being raised on California wines and doing this for a long time, we do have the sun here, and we do get the opulence on our wines, and oftentimes these wines actually don't need food. They're so full. I do feel that quite often when I taste Bordeaux, which is often, there's a complexity that goes on with that, but there's also sort of a lessening of the fruit. And when I have food with a Bordeaux, boy, everything is great. So I'm just wondering if you have maybe some food pairings that you would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing, and I think it goes with for pretty much every wine region in the world, which the food of where the wine is made, if you take some local food, it's going to pair really amazingly with the wine. And I think that's kind of across the board. For Bordeaux, a nice, obviously beef is kind of like the one that comes to mind. I also love that's Bordeaux in general. For this one in particular, I think lamb is just the perfect, you just get a lot of that potency that comes out of the lamb meat. And I think it just like pairs with it incredibly. So yeah, lamb would be for me for this one. For the French one, just, a nice kind of lamb roast. And for the California one, Yeah, probably more of the steak, grilled steak, kind of California style, where you can, enjoy a nice glass and more of that kind of good spirits of good American spirit.
Yeah, Peter will attest to this. One of the things that I do is I love pairing wines with food, but I love pairing wines with music, and because I think that the musical stylings kind of sometimes come through on the wines a little bit, and I think that the Bordeaux, the Martial, has got this. Don't take this in. This is actually a positive, but I get a little bit of grunge rock out of it. I get a little Nirvana that really makes me. I feel like. I feel really, it's part of the soil. It feels earthy. It feels like, it's roots,
You gonna
and
play an example for us?
and with generations, I will tell you that I'm a Van Morrison freak, and the generations to me has always been this almost jazzy kind of style wine that really blends a whole lot of different things together and kind of stands on it. So Moondance would be sort of where I would go with this. So you guys can talk about food. I talk about music. I do want to move forward a little bit on this and not go too long on this, but we talked about the terroir. Any comments that you might have either on the winemaking technique? So Frederick, I noticed that I believe these wines were actually fermented and macerated in cement tanks and then put in a barrel, correct?
Yep.
Any thoughts? Oh, and by the way, one of the comments is if there's any way to raise your voice a little bit, that would be great. Yeah.
Yep, I'll try and speak up. Yep. So yeah, no, that's exactly it. So the winery have concrete tanks in which they fermented wines for generations now, and they macerate for 3 weeks. And one of the advantages of using concrete tanks is that there's a slow maceration, and they actually cold soak for a little bit to really kind of let all of that extraction happen before the wine actually starts fermenting. And the fermentation is rather cool, and yeah, that's why it takes kind of that amount of time. To give everyone an idea, some fermentations can happen in 2-3 days if you just let the wine, put it in a tank, and then temperature goes really high, and then it's just sugars are transformed into alcohol. But allowing a slower process really means that you're going to get softer tannins and a better extraction and just more complexity and a little bit different structure in the wine. It's a little bit better for the palate.
That's
and,
great.
Yeah, then after that it's aged for about 20 months in 70% new French oak, so 70% new barrels and 30% of used barrels that are neutral. And so that's where we get some of the spices that we find in the wine.
So Frederick, can I ask you, this is where my French really goes down, but I've used the term before, éleveur, for a winemaker, and it seems that the French, which is more almost like the midwife, the winemaker is there to deliver the grapes into the bottle to make it taste like the soil, as opposed to put the mark of the winemaker on it. Is there any truth to that?
There is.
Okay.
Yeah. So the approach of the winemaker is really to just like you said, just take what Mother Nature did. The vintage, every vintage is very different, very specific. It changes with weather quite a bit, depending on how much rain we've had, how much sunshine we've had, and so Mother Nature really just makes that wine. And for this particular one, so it's 80% Merlot and 20% of Cabernet Franc. It comes from a single vineyard, single property, and every year they just put it all in the one tank and then just make that fermentation happen. So there's no we can't really play around with different blends or anything like that. It's really, that's what it is. That's what Mother gave to us, kind of the vintage 2015.
Yeah,
so
great. And then Peter, we're maybe in a little bit more traditional, aging and barreling, but I think it's not insignificant to know that your father and his brother were the first people to bring French oak barrels in for aging in the United States. Want to talk a little bit to that?
Actually, we were the first in Napa Valley. Hansel in
Yeah.
Noma, about a year or two earlier, I think he was the ambassador to France, so he had a leg up on us, but brought some barrels in. But my dad actually took a trip to France with Andre Cholochev, I think in the late 1950s, and really got exposed to French oak barrels. And it wasn't until a few years later that they could find the financial means to import these. I mean, these barrels back then were, oh, wow, $20, $30. And you couldn't, we're selling our highest end wine at, I think, I don't know, $2.50 a bottle, and you couldn't even take it up, a dime back in those days. So it was a struggle to afford those wines. Now, of course, they're, I don't know, $1,200 per barrel. But yeah, so Dad was very, very innovative in many different ways and experimental. But I'd like to go back to a comment Frederick made about the latitude of Napa Valley versus Bordeaux. It is hugely significant. When I looked this up a long time ago, I was actually shocked. So if you take a look at the latitude of Napa Valley, we're 38 degrees north. If you take a look at the latitude of Sicily, Italy, it's, I think, 37 degrees north. So think of us kind of as in southern Italy from a latitude standpoint. Obviously, we're not nearly as hot or warm as southern Italy, but the influence, as Frederick properly pointed out, of our coastal, the coastal influence here is just huge.
Yeah.
But from a winemaking standpoint, we have similarities and some, I think, subtle differences as well. We ferment in stainless steel tanks. These are temperature controlled tanks. And we do a cold soak up to about 5 days or so. And cold soak, maybe about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or so. And then we gently warm up and do a fermentation that takes, about a week or a little longer than a week to complete fermentation. And then from there, we pretty quickly go to barrels. We've played with extended maceration of letting the fermented wine and the skins sit together after the fermentation is completed for an extended period of time, up to maybe 3 weeks. We've played with that, but feel that we can retain more of that bright fruit if we drain the wine off right after fermentation is complete or near completed, and then go into barrels. We use all French oak barrels, principally new barrels. I think Eric or Frederick, you're at 70%. I think we're higher than that. I think we're north of 90% new barrels, but pretty close. And we're about 20 months in oak, so very, very similar to your treatment. But it's fascinating how the terroir gives us dramatically different wines here.
I agree with that. You guys, before we get any further, we only have a few minutes. And so so I don't forget this, I want to make sure that everybody knows that there is an opportunity to buy these wines. I'm going to come back with a final question, but first I'm going to talk about maybe what we've got going on here. These wines are available, and they're available through Le Cave. What we've put together is a package where I think, Frederick, all of the wines that you ship here in California, that's free shipping, we're offering up where if there's a 6-pack of, you can mix match the 2 wines, do whatever you want to do with it, that the shipping would be included in the price. We did want to add a little kicker to the whole thing, that if they buy 6 bottles, that they're going to also pick up a bottle of, hopefully I'm not screwing this up, a bottle of the Martial. And then if you, I'm really going to encourage people to go to the intelligent purchase, which is a case, which is 12 bottles, which would get you also the shipping included. But we are sort of trying to sweeten the pot a little bit. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is the 2016 generations in the Magnum bottle. So if we get people up to 2 cases of wine, then we'll also throw this in. This $140 bottle of wine on top of it. And of course, if you do the 12 bottles, we'll throw in the Martial. I'll throw in a bottle of the Generations, and we also have a really wonderful wine opener. So we've got a lot of things to stimulate purchase. I just wanted to kind of bring that out up front. But with only a few minutes left, I think it's been really wonderful talking about the history of these great estates, right? But that's the history. We have a future ahead of us. And we're in the middle of a pandemic. In California, we have fires every year now. We seem to have economic changes. There are difficulties with how to get wine to the consumers just through challenges, legally. There are threats from everything from cannabis to people not drinking at all. So I'm just wondering if we could start maybe with Frederick, with you. What do you see maybe what are some of the challenges just for the wine industry in general, and maybe even specifically for a family-owned operation, Chateau Martial, going forward in the next few decades, let's say?
Thank you, Judd. That is a loaded question. So, obviously many threats. Something that is a huge threat in France is also kind of tax imposed on, something that goes from one generation to the next, and obviously kind of makes it vital to, have a sustainable business to be able to kind of pay that off, per se. I think climate change is also kind of a big differentiator there. The winemaker was actually telling me the other day, in 1982, the wine was 12.8% alcohol. And in 2019, it was actually 14.2. So in just, almost 40 years now, you have kind of a jump in the alcohol, which obviously means a jump in the sugars as well. And so they're actually moving forward. They're gonna, in the vineyard, to kind of prevent the sugars from keeping going and then having a really high alcohol wine, just means they're gonna have to adapt in the vineyard, keep that canopy on top to really protect the grapes, so the skins don't get too thick and so the sugars don't develop too, and would make a wine that would have too much alcohol in it. So I think adapting with everything is key, and I do think that the business that we are in, which is direct to consumer, so directly from the producer, and having the least amount of intermediaries possible, direct to consumer is kind of going to be the way forward in many ways.
So the government environment and the physical environment are the big challenges.
Climate change as well.
Yeah, well, that would be the environmental. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Peter, how about you? You're, we've got 4 generations of Mondavis here, and we're in Napa Valley, where, there's a lot of dialogue going on about the environment. But what do you see are the challenges that are going to be for your kids?
Well, there's many challenges out there. Being in agriculture, there's always a multitude of challenges, but let me focus on a couple of them that I think are from a long-term, from a generational aspect, are important ones, and they're going to echo what Frederick said. Climate change. I mean, that's huge. We see the outcome of it already with the fires we've had in just the last 3 years, and just record-setting number of acres burned here. So that's just one example of what climate change is doing to us. As I say, as an example of the impact, if we have a vineyard that we need to replant today, and it's a great Cabernet land, terroir, we're going to plant Cabernet in it, no questions asked. And let's say that vineyard has a lifespan of 20, 25 years, and we replant it, or our kids replant it in 20 or 25 years, it's going to go back into Cabernet. I don't think there's any question about that. Now, the next time you replant, which now we're talking to maybe 50 years out, I think it's going to be a serious question if Cabernet will still go into that plot. Have we advanced our viticultural techniques and Cabernet so it's adaptable for the higher temperatures, or do we have to go to a different variety that is more conducive to the elevated temperatures? So that's a really long-term issue that not enough has been being done yet to battle that. But we're facing it today with these fires. Another one is the distribution system in the United States. Now, over in Europe, France, other parts of the world, completely different. But we're mandated by the 3-tier system for the most part. And the three-tier system has really boiled down to 2, maybe 3 major distributors in every major market here in the United States. And these distributors, a distributor in a given large market could have well over 10,000 different wine offerings. In Charles Krug, we have like 8 of those over 10,000. And so the distributors are just consolidating and representing more and more wines, and we kind of get lost in there. So that's going to be a big challenge over the next decade or 2 to make sure we don't get lost in that distribution complexity that's out there. I mean, I don't want to minimize a whole bunch of other issues, but I think those are 2 big ones.
Yeah, those are huge ones. Well, I think what we've really done is we've kind of concluded on our time. I do want to do a couple things. Frederick, I'm going to ask you to say, I think what you'd like us, everybody who's watching, you're going to send out an information about the link with the promo code. You want to just say how you want to go forward with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll post this video on the page on the website, which will have the direct links, the promo code to go and benefit from the offers that we have, which is a bottle of wine with 12 bottles or more, and then a magnum of wine for 2 cases or more. And so I'll send everybody the link to this page, including this recording, and so that way you can rewatch at your leisure with maybe other friends and make another nice evening of it. So
that's perfect. And from my standpoint, I just want to say thank you to the 2 of you and everybody else on the audience. Happy holidays to everybody. I want to say cheers, and I want to say good riddance to 2020. And here's to somebody told me they used the expression that here's to the roaring 20s. So let's move forward into 21 and make the roaring 20s the best that we possibly can. So a little cheers to everybody here, and thank you very much, and happy holidays.
Yeah, thank you all, and let's look forward to a great 2021.
It's going to be incredible. Cheers.
Cheers.